Good morning, everyone. We're a little behind, so we're gonna get started. Um, my name is Joshua Bachner. I'm a partner with the law firm of Mandelbaum Barrett, and we're going to have a great panel discussion here today about both hemp and psychedelics. But before we get into it, I just want each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Susan?
Oh, I don't know if this is turned on or not.
It's turned on.
Turned on. Hi, I'm Sue Thaw. I'm a public policy consultant in Washington, D.C. I'm a public health and prevention expert, not a lawyer.
Good morning. I'm Dion Tedder. I am a state senator in South Carolina and also an attorney.
Hi, I'm Dustin Marlin. I'm an assistant professor of law at UNC Chapel Hill, focusing on intellectual property, privacy, and some bioethics issues, which is what leads me here.
So we're going to go through a couple of presentations just to try to level set on the topics. I will say that the four of us had a great conversation in the hall just now, and I'm hoping some of it will remain with us so we could share it with all of you now. But it was a lot of fun coming at it from a lot of different angles. So I'm just going to take you through very quickly, again, to kind of level set some of the issues behind psychedelics and hemp under the law. Many of you know psychedelics. These days, most people are talking about psilocybin, psilocin. They are naturally derived, usually from plants, although there are some that are now synthetic. And obviously, the consequences of that are going to be part of our discussion, a little bit more intense of an experience. Psychedelics, much like cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, has been around for 5,000 years. They have consistently been used for any number of reasons. They really came into fruition beginning of the last century in this country. And more recently, we're seeing some breakthroughs through the use of psychedelics to treat different conditions. In particular, and I'm sure we'll discuss it today, there's been a lot of success, treating PTSD. Much like cannabis, which took about 50 years to get to the point where we are today, decriminalization and legalization. There's been a push across the country, starting at West, as these things seem to do, to legalize psychedelics as well. And as I'm sure many of you know, Colorado, Oregon are at the forefront of that. There's a big litigation in California. Dave Holland was here a second ago. Dave and I worked on a petition. It's the Ames litigation. So it's an attempt to permit the medical use of psychedelics, particularly for end-of-life, right-to-try type scenarios. And on behalf of NORML, National Organization to Reform the Marijuana Law, we actually submitted a brief. And the theme of the brief was, it took 50 years to get cannabis medicine to people. Let's not let another 50 years go by to get psychedelic medicine to people. But again, treating it as medicine in that kind of controlled environment. And we've had some success out in the Ninth Circuit where the courts basically found that the DEA and the FDA need to stop relying on studies that are 60, 70 years old and reconsider for the modern day. So psilocybin, controlled one substance. I'm sure you all know what that means. It, according to the federal government, has no medicinal value whatsoever. Slow, I wouldn't say steady, slow progress is being made at the federal level to reconsider this. For years, universities were afraid to touch it for any kind of medical research type purposes because they didn't want to lose federal funding. But now we're seeing them not care so much about that. And you can go a few blocks from here, and there are studies being conducted with psychedelic psilocybin in particular, medicinal studies. Not going to take you through it all. You could all read. California has been advancing some legislation towards legalization, but most of these things kind of start. There's a lot of fanfare about it, and they die in the vine. Colorado, again, a little bit more advanced. They've tried on a number of occasions to get it through, not with success, but they are trying to foster an environment where, again, you could have legalized psychedelic use for medicinal purposes. And that's their Natural Medicine Act. All of this is, again, highly regulated by the state in a medicinal environment, probably overregulated, frankly. Leave it up to the doctors. You could have home grow if you want to grow mushrooms in your basement now in Colorado. Again, you could all read. They're kind of taking it slow. They're trying to be considerate with respect to some of the new medicinal studies that are coming out. By the end of this year, they're supposed to have a process in place for licensing applications and licensing of psychedelic operators. New Jersey, across the river, they keep putting forward a bill in the Senate trying to legalize. There's been much discussion about it. But as we learned on September 12th, just a couple of weeks ago, they took a big step back with their hemp program. And I guess we could debate shortly whether it was a step back or a step forward with their hemp program that really changed the entire dynamic of the hemp industry in that state. So with a focus on stopping intoxicating hemp, so I'm not so sure that they're going to get very far with the psychedelics. New York, too, there's always someone who puts forward a bill. For those of you who have been under a rock, New York government, New York City government's kind of at an impasse these days. Newsflash. So I don't think much is going to be coming out of Albany. But there's always someone who tries to put forward a bill. The problem here, again, is the Office of Cannabis Management in New York is probably going to be the regulatory agency, and it has been decimated. The entire licensing side has basically quit from the general counsel on down. And the enforcement side is unfortunately on steroids, $13 million in funds given to the head of enforcement, Dan Hockney, to basically run ramshot across the state, acting as law enforcement. Oregon, again, kind of get ahead of the rest. Sure, all of you know Portland legalized quite some time ago. But it's, again, everyone kind of has the same regulatory framework that they adopted with cannabis to try to establish a medicinal marketplace. So we'll see what happens with psilocybin. I don't know that there's going to be a federal reclassification anytime soon. Obviously, like so many things, it's going to depend upon what happens in November. Ideally, the states will continue to be the foreground and the vanguard of what's happening, again, much like they were with cannabis and establishing programs with Oregon and Colorado in the lead. And we're kind of going to see how things develop. But as you can see, the Colorado program is good for another 8 years. So there's going to be a lot of slow movement over time. Now on to hemp. I'm sure everyone knows 2018 Farm Bill is where it all began. It legalized hemp, separated it from marijuana. So now you have both marijuana and hemp coming from the same plant. Hemp is no longer a Schedule I narcotic. Marijuana, of course, remains. Federal definition, which we'll have a lot of fun debating soon, I'm sure, is less than 0.3% delta 9 by dry weight. You know, give a pause. Do people know all this stuff already? Are we in a room of some yes, some no? So it's worth the exercise? Okay. All right. We weren't sure who the audience was and if we were talking to you at this level or this level, but we'll breeze through. So that's the big difference between hemp and marijuana is the dry measure, 0.3%. And as we'll soon discuss, I imagine, the dry measure only works really with flower, right? It doesn't work necessarily if you're measuring something that's not dry, say, oh, I don't know, a hemp beverage, where you can actually have a significant amount of THC. It just doesn't cross that 3% threshold by dry weight and therefore can have an intoxicating effect. So what we really had is this intention at the federal level with the Farm Bill to create a hemp industry, right? Industrialized hemp, right? George Washington famously was a hemp farmer, right? You all know sails and rope, and I think jeans back in the day were all made from hemp. But what we found was that, you know, people get high ideas, right? And they realize that you could actually take hemp with this federal definition and create intoxicating products. And so over the past 6 years, there has emerged intoxicating hemp, and it is a massive, massive industry. Predictions are, you know, 30, 40, $50 billion just in New York State alone over the course of the next few years if things stay on this trajectory, and they may not for reasons we'll discuss. So it runs parallel to the marijuana industry. So whereas marijuana, again, requires very particular licenses, it's this regulated environment in New Jersey by the OCM, across the river by the Cannabis Regulatory Commission. Each state has their own scheme. Yeah, I'll take a question. Okay, so no, that's a great question. So I'll give you, I think we should open this up. The simple answer is it's a carbon molecule. So if you take away a carbon molecule from delta 9, you get delta 8. You add a carbon molecule to delta 9, what do you get? Delta 10, right? Right? Now, having said that, that's the science. Sue, you want to talk more about what it means?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you can take little bits of the CBD from hemp and put them through a process that involves, to some extent, heavy metals, some, other things that can end up staying in the final product, which are really unhealthy. So they're semi-synthetic because the core of it is little bits of CBD, but then they go through a chemical process to come out the other end. That's for Delta 8. Delta 8 is a semi-synthetic drug. So that one doesn't occur naturally in the hemp plant, or if it does, must be in tiny, tiny, you know.
Mhm.
Right.
Right, the isomerization.
Yeah, so
I was
we're not- None of
oversimplifying.
us
You're
are
right.
chemists. These guys are lawyers. I'm a public health expert. So thank you very much for that. But anyway, yeah, I was going to talk some about this whole industry came out of a legal loophole in the Farm Bill. I don't think anybody had any idea that this is where it was going to go.
Absolutely. And yeah, you're right. It's technically it's a different bonds. But the federal definition allows for different isomers, right? And extracts and compounds. So the federal definition actually arguably allows for delta 8. And in fact, there's a very recent case out of the Fourth Circuit that agreed. It adopted a case out of the Ninth Circuit called AK Futures, which was actually, again, I realize it's a Sunday morning, so forgive me if I'm boring you to death. There was this AK Futures trademark case on the topic, and the court, within the context of a trademark dispute, actually sought to define and determine whether Delta 8 fit within the federal definition of hemp under the Farm Bill, and it said it did. The Fourth Circuit recently adopted that reasoning in a employment law dispute where the plaintiff sued her employer and was claiming that she wasn't using, I mean, she was drug tested and came out positive, but she was claiming she was using legal drugs, Delta 8. And so they had to go through this analysis to determine whether Delta 8 was actually legal. The court found that under the federal definition, where you can allow for isomers and extracts and different compounds, it was legal. They adopted the Ninth Circuit's reasoning, and they rejected the DEA's reasoning on the approach. And this has all happened 2 weeks ago. This is kind of happening in real time. So you're the Ninth Circuit, you're California? You're in? Yeah, all right. So it's kind of fun, right? I mean, one day this is legal, the next day it's not. And it is. I mean, to your point, a lot of it just comes down to the science and how the courts are trying to interpret the chemistry. So this is the difference between the 14 and 18 and the dramatic difference in 18 that allowed for hemp. Technically, it was supposed to come up this year. Similarly, I guess, to New York and New York City, not a lot of movement is happening down in DC legislatively, so they weren't actually able to figure out how to renew the Farm Bill. Maybe, was it 3-4 months ago, there was a lot of discussion. Secretary of Department of Agriculture, Chair of the Agricultural Committee, were all discussing maybe some restrictions, limitations on hemp to kind of take the intoxicating hemp piece out from underneath the Farm Bill, but hasn't been much movement there. And that's what this was. So, right now, it is being left to the states. Things are happening very quickly there too. In New York, last July, the state passed an emergency justification to change all of the laws governing hemp because of concerns about access to minors. Minors is 21 and under, and the intoxicating effects outside of the more heavily regulated marijuana space. A judge, Judge Marcel up in Albany, issued an injunction prohibiting the new regulations from going into place and finding that the state violated the Administrative Procedures Act in implementing them, but also the bases for the regulations were not substantiated by the studies and reports upon which the state was relying. The state then passed the same regulations in November. They just didn't do it under an emergency justification, so that went through. Those went into effect December 15th. And so for many of my clients, I represent a lot of hemp operators, licensees, manufacturers, distributors, beverage companies. My clients, it was kind of like if on December 16th, they woke up, if you were an alcohol store, and anything that was over 40 proof is illegal. So they all woke up and were now involved in RICO conspiracies, right? Because all of their product is contraband. The new ratios that were set, it's a 15-to-1 milligram ratio instead of this dry weight measure, rendered most of their product illegal. So everything on their shelves, everything in their warehouses was contraband. And that's been going on now for just about a year. And we are actually litigating up back before the same judge, Marcel, the impacts of that legislation. Most particularly, there's been a lot of raids. So what we're seeing now in New York, which is very upsetting, particularly in the city, are licensed hemp stores getting raided by armed law enforcement. And they come in and they seize product, throw it down the drain, and the rest. They're basically catching up the state licensed hemp stores in this dragnet against all the illicit marijuana stores, which I'm sure you've all seen. You go any direction from here and you can buy at a bodega or anywhere else intoxicating products, usually intoxicating hemp products, but they're all outside of the safe and regulated market that's licensed. My clients are just getting caught up in that. I don't really know that we care about the legal status of hemp seeds. THCA might be fun though. And again, panelists feel free. The A stands for an acid. It is completely non-psychoactive until you decarboxylate it, which of course means burn. So as soon as you light it on fire, it does create a psychoactive effect. And as many of you know, that's a useful way to use hemp flowers. You light it on fire, smoke it. So there's now something that a lot of the states are adopting called total THC. And that's where they take the Delta 9 measure, they add the THCA post-decarboxylated measure, they multiply it by a ratio, it's 0.8775. And I think that has to do with the mole we all learned about back in chemistry in like 11th grade. I've since forgotten. But so they multiply it by that, and then they add it to the THC measure. And as a result, all products are going to be illegal, right? Because once you add that post-decarboxylated THCA, that acid, to the Delta 9 concentration, you're going to be above that 3% threshold. So again, everything just becomes illegal by fiat. New York did that. New Jersey does that. Some other states do it as well. There we go. And I'm out. You want to go with your presentation? Sure. And we're a small crowd, so obviously if you have questions for Sue or for any of the panelists in the midst, like this woman did, feel free to just raise your hand.
That's me. Thank you. Okay. Hey, good morning. So, it's Sunday morning. Everybody's had their coffee, I hope. So Josh just told you about the definition of what makes hemp hemp, and it's the 0.3% dry weight basis of the whole hemp plant. So there were consequences of the 2018 Farm Bill and hemp legalization. A lot of people decided this was the next big thing, and they put a lot of money into growing hemp. And then, of course, the bottom fell out of the hemp market. So the farmland devoted to hemp rose like 445%. Massive amounts of hemp were produced, which caused the price to fall by 50%. So at that point, CBD producers became the main purchasers of hemp, but then there was an oversupply of CBD. So this is, economics 101. So producers looked for new hemp-based products, including synthetic and semi-synthetic cannabinoids, which we're calling here derived psychoactive cannabis products, or DPCPs, which are made by simple low-cost chemical transformations of hemp extracts like CBD to substances that are not controlled under federal drug laws. So everybody's heard of Delta 8, Delta 10, THC 0. There's a whole bunch of these now. There are 26 separate ones, and we'll get to that in a minute. But hemp producers also, and Josh talked about this too, started manufacturing high-potency THC products derived from the 0.3% THC dry weight in the hemp plants. And all of these products are basically unregulated across the U.S. A lot of states have tried to regulate them, and It has not worked, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation. A number of states have banned them, but they ban what they know about, and then this is an industry that continues to innovate all the time to get out from under the regulations. So there are major issues with the 0.3% THC in hemp, which is that it applies to the entire plant by dry weight. So if you put 3 ounces, like say I have a muffin that's 3 ounces of muffin, the 0.3% can actually contain 255 milligrams of THC, which is many times the dose that causes impairment. So you now have stuff that's even more potent in some cases than high potency cannabis, and it's called hemp. And basically, this is an advertisement. Americans can now ship legal THC to their home in every state, whether or not that state has actually passed marijuana legalization or not. So that's very interesting. This is an industry in some cases that's competing with the legal marijuana market in states that have legalized. So this is a beverage called Climbing Kite, sold in the state of Iowa, even though marijuana itself has not been legalized there. And it can contain up to 10 milligrams of THC and 10 milligrams of CBD derived from hemp. And that's why they're claiming that it's legal, because the 2 court cases that you just talked about would say that it was, because it was derived from hemp, which under the Farm Bill is legal. So we're in this sort of unintended consequence. Nobody thought through when they passed the Farm Bill that this was going to cause the proliferation of new psychoactive substances that nobody had ever used or heard of before. So what are these called? There's semi-synthetic cannabinoids, hemp-derived intoxicating cannabinoids, or derived psychoactive cannabis products. They're called all of those. So as I said, they're basically a chemical conversion, mostly of the CBD to these products, and it involves refluxing CBD and organic solvents with acids that serve as a catalyst. The process does involve aggressive synthetic conditions that use both strong acids and strong bases to neutralize them. And the chemical conversion can result in massive impurities, dangerous chemicals, and basically poisonous shit being left behind in the final product. Yeah, I had to wake everybody up. It's Sunday morning. Yeah, such as strong acids and heavy metals. So, we don't know even the short-term consequences of a lot of this, because it's not been around long enough to have any long-term studies, no less the long-term health and psychiatric consequences of this. The first and best known of these synthetic cannabinoids was delta-8 THC, which I'm sure everybody has heard of. And it's basically was the fastest growing segment of the marijuana industry. Sometimes this is called the bathtub gin of marijuana world. It can include lead. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. One of the big problems with these is that they're purposely made attractive to kids. They're not regulated at all. They're sold in bodegas, gas stations, head shops. You can get them almost anywhere, and it's a problem because they're not just sold, say, in dispensaries, but literally across the street from school in the place the kids get snacks. This stuff is there. It's less than $5, and it looks exactly like regular candies. These are real products that are like trademark infringed. And it is interesting, the FDA did go after, and the FTC together, maybe 5 or 6 of the companies that were the worst offenders of actually using these trademarks to put both marijuana products and these synthetic cannabinoids in. But this has caused major poisonings and increase in poison control and emergency room visits among kids, because they cannot distinguish between these things that are highly psychoactive and the real candies. THC 0 is another one of these synthetic cannabinoids. They're claiming it's 3 times stronger than delta-9 THC. This one is actually a psychedelic compound. This is what delta 0 gummies look like. One gummy is 25 milligrams of THCO, and there's 10 per pack. Well, 25 milligrams of THCO is a shit ton. Okay, it's a lot. And again, there's no portion sizes on these things. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please. They are seeing problems with. Yes, they're definitely sending kids to the hospital. I don't know how many of you remember bath salts and yeah, K2 spice. Those were literally sprayed on to plant matter, said not for human consumption, but they were sold in gas stations, bodegas, and it's the same sort of things we're seeing. Kids are foaming at the mouth. We have EMS showing up in schools. There's been psychotic episodes. I can get to this in the end, but these things are not regulated at all in their manufacturing. I guess you'll say that maybe some of your clients are doing some testing, but a lot of the heavy metals and the acids and the bases that are made to produce them end up in the final product. So to some degree, they're poisonous and they're not regulated particularly at all. This is really the Wild West of not regulating something, again, because it's a legal gray area for the most part. But they're marketed in ways that are extremely likely to attract kids, candy, chips, chocolates, very inexpensive, as I said, less than $5. So in places like inner city Detroit, where it's a food desert, you can go into the bodega and buy some of this and, get high and go back to school. Problem. And there's no age restrictions. At this point, these are really totally unregulated, and I'll get in a minute to, I'm not looking to regulate them, unlike my other co-panelists here. I frankly think these never should have existed to start with, and that we should ban them, not to put people in jail, not to make them, quote, illegal, but to basically shut down their manufacture. We have enough going on with the, quote, legal marijuana industry and all of those products and the problems with regulating that. This is a whole industry that personally, and I'm sorry for your clients, I think should never have existed except for this legal loophole. And I would like to see this part of the industry actually closed down. So the harms from 2021 to 2022, and this is the most recent data, U.S. Poison Control Centers managed 82% more cases, 3,358 involving exposure. And this is just to Delta-8 DHC. This doesn't include the other 25. I think there are now 26 of these synthetic cannabinoids. So studies suggest negative health effects similar to those from Delta-9, but in some cases a lot more severe because Delta-9 is not synthetic, it's from the plant. So there's continuous engineering of these. So I'm going to go to the next one here. There's 26 intoxicating compounds being marketed. The issue is overall 54% of these are blends containing 2 to 8 different intoxicating compounds in a single product. So the issue here is we don't know anything about these things particularly singularly, but we know absolutely nothing about these when you start putting 2 to 8 of them together in one product and selling them to kids. So an online retail assessment done by Dr. Matthew Rosheim and his colleagues at the University of North Texas Health Science Center found there are 185 different combinations of these intoxicating compounds contained with about 804 different products. So there's very little understanding of the health effects from using any of these compounds individually, let alone in these various combinations. So we have no short or long-term health effect data basically on any of this. So I want to just show you what they look like. And so the product that's all the way, the purple one at the end there, look what it has. It has live resin with D8 plus THCB, THCX, THCH, THCP, PHC, XCP. I mean, good luck. Like nobody has a clue what's in here, but it does get you really high. These things definitely are psychoactive. So here's the other thing. These are available in all states in the US, even in states like New York, which you explained have banned these products. But, and I showed you they're appealing to kids. So they look like Doritos. It's a problem. So here's why regulations don't work. States with laws designed to limit potency or availability found no significant association in the availability of these products. So states with limited to no Delta 8 regulations, 92% had intoxicating cannabis products sold in their states. States with laws designed to limit potency and availability, 90% sold intoxicating cannabis products. So there's no statistical difference between states that are trying to regulate these and states that are not regulating them at all. They're available almost everywhere in those states. And it's not surprising that the regulations don't work because the products are being designed to circumvent the regulations. Get rid of Delta 8, then come up with another 25 different, compounds and then put them all together. And at some point, who's regulating this? And I want to make the point too, regulations mean you have to spend money on bureaucrats. Nobody wants to raise taxes. Nobody wants more bureaucrats. So it's very difficult to actually regulate these. And it's interesting that in New York, they're starting to actually enforce this because regulations without enforcement are useless, and bans without enforcement are useless. So I think that the semi-synthetic intoxicating cannabinoids should be banned rather than regulated. They're very widely accessible. They're harmful. We can't appropriately regulate them. States aren't really able to regulate their way out of this. And in states that have banned them, they were available in 46% of the stores. So bans work to some extent, but they're not great, and they only work if they're enforced. And we need basically strong enforcement. And my thing is, I don't think anyone should be in jail for using these or selling these. I do think there should be fines if these are banned or if people are selling stuff that, isn't tested and is poisonous. Large fines for non-compliance, and if you keep non-complying, you should be put out of business. We're not looking to put more people in jail, and users definitely are not who should be the targets of any of this. So the Farm Bill update, I don't know that you went into Mary Miller's amendment, but they did in the House Agriculture Committee mark up the Farm Bill in committee, and Representative Mary Miller from Illinois introduced an amendment that would basically change the definition of hemp to specifically exclude semi-synthetic cannabinoids that have similar effects to Delta-9 THC, as well as quantifiable amounts of THC as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture in consultation with HHS. This is a very controversial amendment. It passed en bloc, which means that they put 20 amendments together and did a voice vote. It did pass out of committee. We, the group that I represent, did a letter to the House and the Senate in support of this, and we had 51 big national organizations, the American Academy of Psychiatrics, the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatrists, the Consumer Federation of America. A lot of public health and public safety groups signed on saying that they do agree that they like Mary Miller's amendment. The Hemp Roundtable and other people that are, represented by my colleagues on the panel don't like this, and they would like something like Ron Wyden dropped a bill last Thursday trying to regulate these, and we would actually prefer the Mary Miller amendment. And with that, I cede my time to my next panel.
Hi, everyone. So I don't know how anyone gets any sleep in this city. I was up 6 times last night between the car horns and the sirens and then the garbage truck. So I apologize if this is less cogent than it might otherwise have been, or Delta 8.
Oh.
I just wanted to provide a brief history of psychedelics and the law as I was tasked with by Judge Mary. Psychedelics as distinct from cannabis in this case. So some of this is review from my co-panelist, Joshua, so I'll run through it quite quickly. These are plants that come from different chemical families producing certain hallucinogenic or otherwise mystical experiences, euphoria, higher openness, psychedelic coming from Humphrey Osmond's portmanteau of mind and soul and to make manifest. These have long been used well before they came into cultural prominence in the 1960s and the resulting fallout from that. Four main substances, five if you consider ayahuasca as distinct from DMT, that are considered the classic psychedelics when people think of other substances like MDMA as psychedelics or kratom is common now. I mean, these aren't really psychedelics in the classic pharmacological sense. Mescaline, psilocybin, DMT, the active compound in ayahuasca and LSD, which is a synthetic substance not found in nature, whereas the other ones are natural plant medicines. Medicine might have been a slip of the tongue there. So history of psychedelic laws. I mean, certainly people think of history as going back to 1970 and the U.S. Controlled Substances Act. The history is much more complicated than that. There were certain suppression of psychedelics going well before then. State criminal prohibitions against peyote, leading to First Amendment based arguments by the Native American Church and People v. Woody and certain other religious freedom cases that I may get to, as well as some of the other bans listed on the slide. Certainly, psychedelics came into prominence during the 1960s counterculture. Modern research on psychedelics in the U.S. beginning in the 1870s or about and openly accepted until the early 1960s. So certainly this, what's dubbed the psychedelic renaissance in the past decade, I think, gaining prominence with Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, was not the first wave of research. Prior to prohibition on psychedelics, there were thousands of research papers, several dozen books, many conferences regarding not just psychedelics, but psychedelics as medicine, psychedelic drug therapy. At least in sort of what's become distilled, it was a certain problematic project called the Harvard Research Project, led by Timothy Leary, who became a counterculture icon, some would say a zealot, and Richard Alpert, who became the spiritual figure known as Ram Dass after many psychedelic experiences. And their goal was to characterize at Harvard the subjective effects of psychedelics in various naturalistic environments. They used psychedelics on human subjects, generating a whole lot of controversy and some fairly wild stories that came out of that. And it's well known to have sort of signaled or been a catalyst toward ending the sort of free nature of psychedelics during the 1960s. Prior to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, there were a number of, I think, laws that made it more likely that something like the U.S. Controlled Substances Act would have passed in 1970. In 1961, the UN Single Convention didn't target the classic psychedelics, but did regulate other what came to be known as controlled substances. In 1962, there was an expansion of the FDA authority under the Kefauver-Harris amendments. 1965, laws saying that no person can sell compounds with a hallucinogenic effect except by special permits, so increasing the regulations. The criminalization of LSD occurred 2 years before the U.S. Controlled Substances Act under Nixon. So this was shut down research and common acceptance of these substances for some 55 years now. Following prohibition, we're seeing pockets of liberalization, be that decriminalization, state law psychedelic therapy, and other sort of permutations of that. And we see psychedelics being rebranded now as medicinal in nature. So I thought, yeah. It shouldn't, because technically LSD is a synthetic. I'm not sure if people are necessarily making that distinction. Psychedelic medicine might include LSD, might include MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy, but plant medicines typically referring to ayahuasca, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, perhaps. I think that would be an accurate statement, yeah. So I'm drawn to, this sort of cognitive liberty approach in my own research. I'm not going to read that whole thing, but I did think it was sort of a powerful analogy that perhaps we should work toward not banning these things, because people do find, whether they're reliable medicines or not, a whole lot of subjective information that could be contained, in this, and perhaps we shouldn't judge whether that's a hallucination or whether these are, actual, real modes of consciousness that are unavailable without access to plant medicines or psychedelic medicines more broadly. You can see here the table of controlled substances producing some, I think, very controversial results. I mean, you have MDMA listed in the same category as heroin. Marijuana also included in the same category as heroin, considered to have a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. And then you have substances beneath that would seem to be perhaps more harmful than the classic psychedelics and cannabis. So this is a very political categorization, not necessarily one that has the support of the medical field, as I'm sure those in the field would or possibly do agree. And now I'd mentioned that there's this sort of renaissance. Dr. Roland Griffiths, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, saying that these are so powerful that if misaligned with cultural institutions, they can result in cultural kickback. In the 1960s, becoming aligned with the anti-war movement and radicalized youth that was terrifying to existing political structures and institutions. And as a consequence, legislation was put up against them, funding dried up. They were considered a third rail in academic research. So we need to proceed cautiously. It's going to be critically important not to threaten existing cultural institutions. I've been a proponent of medicalization because with medicalization, we already have regulatory structures in place. So perhaps there is a political dimension to this medicalization, although that may be the smartest move at this point, to the extent we want to avoid another 1960s reversal. So I'm going to talk about the varieties of psychedelic law reform. And I should mention, I should have cited it. This relies heavily on my colleague Mason Marks' research, and I think it was called The Varieties of Psychedelic Law Reform or something similar, that recently came out, and I believe JAMA. So we're seeing varieties of sort of a patchwork of state laws, despite the Controlled Substances Act being in full force. Decriminalization by ballot measure or city council vote. These are resolutions or ordinances designed to eliminate or decrease criminal penalties associated with psychedelics, covering a range of substances, some covering, just psilocybin mushrooms as the original bellwether ordinance in Denver to, including, all natural plant medicines or even ones that are synthetic in nature, such as LSD or even non-psychedelic like Oregon recently decriminalized all drugs to very controversial results. Then there's supported adult use. And I don't want to make too much of the distinction between supported adult use and medical use. Certain jurisdictions are kind of in the middle, different drafts of different bills seem to be hovering. New York, for example, it's not totally clear that you need a medical condition such as PTSD to enter these treatment facilities. But these are, it's not that you're walking into a shop and purchasing psychedelics, but rather you go into these sort of, institutions and there is, either doctors or at least trip sitters that are, sort of helping out for the period that you are intoxicated. Religious exemptions certainly have been a narrow exception for some time. I think it's important to realize that you need to provide in general, under the Supreme Court's guidance, a sincerely held religious belief to obtain these exemptions. You can't sort of, use the substance and be like, I really, think I, found, God in using under this mystical experience. I mean, you need to actually have a, committed belief over time in order to claim these religious exemptions. Some bills are strictly clinical research bills. They're not actually legalizing or decriminalizing anything, but they're carving out sort of research under the Controlled Substances Act so that more research can be generated to try to come up with some sort of a policy proposal, policy analysis similar. So there's some bureaucracy involved here too. But a number of different laws. The slide's a bit dated at this point, but I wasn't able to find the current 2024 data, but at least as early as 2023, you have half the states considering 74 psychedelic liberalization bills, 10 enacted, 32 still active, increasing. I'm not sure if that's the case for 2023 or not, but you do at least see that sharp spike there based on 2019 to 2022. Projected that in about 10 years, 15 years, most states will have passed legislation legalizing psychedelics. And then finally, I just wanted to conclude with a recent event that was, yeah. I don't think it's going to be in the 7-Eleven. I think it's going to be decriminalization. I mean, a range of, law enforcement making it their quote unquote lowest priority to, like we're seeing in Oregon and Colorado and perhaps New York, treatment centers with psychedelic assisted therapy, either strictly medical use or supported adult use or some combination where you pay money. It's not clear whether it's going to be, any insurance is going to cover it or not. It's very expensive, but you go into these facilities and you trip under supervision and you leave. I don't see a market in the future like.
I definitely do if it's legalized. Are you kidding me?
Depends on, how strictly it's regulated.
Right, that's exactly right. It will be in 7-Eleven. Absolutely, it will be.
Well, I mean, I think
A bodega.
I mean, we're seeing sort of these, not psilocybin, but other types of mushrooms for sale at convenience stores, and the efficacy of them is a little bit, it's not clear that they're doing, a lot. They're mixed with Delta-8. But I think a lot of these decriminalization measures are, it's not that there are licenses being granted or development or distribution regimes. I mean, there's not a supply chain that's going with these ordinances. So I'm not sure that, we're necessarily going to see that, although I guess it's possible that we'll see derivations in the way that we see Delta-8 and THC and perhaps, there'll be legalized psychedelics in that vein. So this was, fairly, very recent and controversial. I think a lot of proponents of psychedelic medicine were hoping that the FDA was going to approve Lykos Pharma. This is the organization previously known as MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, to use MDMA-assisted therapy specifically to combat post-traumatic stress disorder. It was not granted, with the agency asking Lykos to study further the efficacy and safety of the treatment. There were concerns regarding the inability to conduct valid double-blind studies, allegations of therapist misconduct and abuse, and biased data. And this is considered for the psychedelic renaissance in the psychedelic medicine industry a significant setback for the company and the broader movement to bring psychedelics into the mainstream, because this was considered a bellwether for classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD. Now it's, I think, more likely that psilocybin will be the first psychedelic-assisted therapy rather than MDMA. There was some a hearing that was extended to the public where there was talk of Lykos, MDMA, MAPS sort of being a therapy cult, and that's Rick Doblin at Psychedelic Science 2023, certainly not doing any favors to that conception in his white suit. But I don't think this will be the last of the FDA's looking at applications. I think this is still going to be a big industry. So I'll stop there.
All right, so yeah, we're going to do questions. Look, PowerPoint brought down the space shuttle, so I think it's probably more fun for us to just kind of get into it. 38 states and counting have legalized, right? DC, Guam, it's tens of billions of dollars a market. I'm just talking cannabis. We'll go into psychedelics. How do you put the toothpaste back in the tube at this point? I'll open it up.
For which substance?
Cannabis, we're on cannabis. Hemp, marijuana.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
We have really good data on its effectiveness and safety, et cetera, for the therapist assisted, prepared, and I'm a believer. But no, what's happening a lot in the press is self-administration of microdosing, and nobody's talked to that. Could someone?
With which product? Cannabis or
No,
psychedelics?
the
Psychedelics,
psilocybin.
well, you could microdose of both, right? Okay, yeah. No, thoughts?
Well, go ahead. I don't know specifically about the research. I've seen a tremendous amount of stuff in the New York Times that's anecdotal from people who say that it's really helped them. But again, I'm not the expert on psychedelics. I don't know if any of you can speak. Maybe you can speak to microdosing.
There is a lot of citizen science that says it's effective, but it may also be due to the placebo effect. There haven't been any, I don't think, valid studies that
There are no
has
valid
efficacy.
studies on microdosing.
Right, so that you can't say that it's like an FDA-approved medicine or that yeah, it works for, it's anecdotal evidence.
So microdosing, for those of you who don't know, is just that. Usually it's about, what, 2.5 milligrams of, in this case, some sort of a mushroom-based psychedelic product. And a lot of people use it as you would anti-anxiety medication or even an antidepressant. But because they believe it's plant-based, they consider it to be a safer alternative to a pharmaceutical. Yes, sir.
It is problematic filing for a federal trademark for a cannabis product. Is there a strategy to wedge this in use of the brand in a hemp-related product that's legal and looking at it as kind of a stake in the ground for when and if cannabis is legalized at the federal level while also doing a trademark at the state level? Is it a strategy? Is it something that makes sense?
So for those of you who don't know there as well, you can get a patent, but you can't get a trademark for cannabis-based products, even though it's the Patent and Trademark Office. And it goes back to an old case it was a machine that someone developed that was a competitor to a popcorn machine like they used to have back when they had movie theaters. And there was a question as to the legality of what was being produced. And the Supreme Court held that under the Constitution, which provides for patents and trademarks and copyrights, it was only a question of the novelty of the product. The legality of its use was outside of the office with respect to patents. And so for that reason, you can get a patent because it doesn't matter that what you're doing is legal or not, right, at the federal level. So you can get a cannabis patent, even though cannabis is technically still a Schedule I narcotic. But you can't get a trademark because the law on trademark is different. So to answer your question, no. I don't think there's going to be much of anything happening at that level. There are state protections, as you've noted. Even with the rescheduling, I don't know that that's going to change anything from an intellectual property perspective. And most people are more concerned, frankly, on the patent mark. The trademarks are useful, obviously, when you're branding, but I think you can now patent strains, right? So there is a lot of value for that, particularly because some of these strains have significant value in the marketplace.
Let me clarify my question, if I
Yeah.
could. Specifically, taking a cannabis brand, asking your client to grow some hemp, stick it in a package with the same brand, mail it somewhere within the state. So now conceivably there could be a trademark on the hemp-related product. What and if it's legalized at the federal level? They're so related. I'm thinking it might be a stake in the ground for that.
Oh, I see what you're saying. For the brand, yeah, you
the brand.
could certainly trademark a hemp brand and call it, Sue's
Flying
Hemp.
kites,
Although
they've
there you
done
go,
it
right?
in
Yeah,
The alcohol industry, yeah,
yeah.
they've done it.
You could certainly do that. And then you're saying just transition once cannabis is legal, it's the same plant, increase
I
the
have a
THC
stake in the
concentrations.
ground.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because the trademark wouldn't really be related to what the product is. It's the
Now I know what I'm
branding.
doing on Monday.
Okay,
With that
very good.
information.
I will also mention in terms of trademark that, a lot of, I've represented cannabis and social equity clients in the past, and a strategy controversial. I mean, some people have referred to it as trademark laundering. There's some articles by Sam Kamen and Viva Moffat talking about this practice of, okay, well, what else do you sell? Cigarettes or nicotine products, and you can do that, or promotional items like T-shirts, and perhaps there's a halo of protection for those other goods and services.
Can we let Devon speak? I mean, he flew all the way up here from,
Tell us what's going on in South Carolina.
yeah.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I didn't do a PowerPoint because I just talk about it. And so, where we are, he mentioned the 38 states. South Carolina is not included in that. We tend to be last on things, all things progressive. And so, where we are, we actually have been trying to pass a just simply medical cannabis, and it's by far the most conservative medical cannabis bill in the country. It's not allowed to be smoked, burned, or anything. It's just all, it has to be an edible, which arguably I think there's some arguments there that may not be the best effective when it comes to treating medicine as far as the dosage and monitoring that. But we've been unable to, it passes in the Senate and it dies in the House. And so there's some political reasons behind that. But to go back to, there was a question about, will this stuff be in the 7-Elevens. And so I think that you can regulate that. I mean, and so, and I know you can't regulate it, but here's why, because in South Carolina, I mean, just look at, for instance, alcohol. I mean, there are certain states you can go to the CVS and get liquor. You can't do that in South Carolina or North Carolina because we don't allow it. And so I don't think that just by decriminalizing something or legalizing it will just open the floodgates as long as you have regulation. Speaking of regulation, those hemp seltzers that are now popular, the Delta 8 drinks that have CBD, we're in a battle now. We have a company, actually some companies that moved into the state. They're manufacturing and distributing, and so they're bringing jobs, and it's, they're following the guidelines. However, our Department of Health sent out a letter telling them that it was illegal, that they had to shut it down. The problem is there's no regulation. And so what we did, our speaker sent a request for the AG to do an opinion on whether or not it's legal. And the only thing that we have to go back to, because there's really no case law in South Carolina, is the Farm Bill. As long as it's 0.3% derived, it's legal. And so as long as they're meeting that requirement, we can't technically ban it because we don't know it's there, which is why I think you'll see a big push, particularly us next year, with legislation just regulating the industry. We have to catch up to it. The same with medical cannabis is what we're trying to do, is regulate it so that it's safe, because what we see is, regardless whether we agree on it or not, if you don't regulate it and you don't allow it, particularly for those patients with epilepsy and anxiety that could benefit from it, PTSD veterans, you sort of allow people to go to this underground market where they use products that are not safe. And so that's why I'm a proponent of regulation, because then we can keep the bad actors out, and let these companies that are going to follow the rules. They're going to get the testing that's required. They're going to apply for the licenses. And so we know we can track what products are being sold and used versus this, you just going into some random bodega and buying something and you have no idea what it is.
Except even every state that has legalized, most of the product is still sold on the illicit market. Why? Because when you tax and regulate something, you raise the price of it. And if it's totally legalized, there's no consequences, particularly for the people who are selling to undercut the legal market in the black market, or the illicit market. Excuse me, I can't say black market anymore. It's in the lexicon of words you're not allowed to use. No, but
they won't have a license though. So then
yeah, but no one's shutting them down. The whole point is that regulation only works if you have regulators who are actually in place, who are regulating something. And again,
Enforcing the regulation.
you have to enforce the regulations, and that's not happening. It's just not happening because it takes money. It takes
Well,
money to enforce.
But let me
things.
challenge that. New York City, the NYPD is the 7th largest
Yep.
militarized force on the planet. All right? We have, as we discussed outside, thousands of bodegas, illicit stores, unlicensed stores selling this product. Okay? How do you do better than that? And you still have the problem. How are you actually going to create enforcement? NYPD's got a lot of money, right? So how do you actually
It has to
enforce?
be a priority for law enforcement, and it isn't at this point. My son's a DC cop. There's no way in the world he's going to spend 1 minute arresting anybody for any of this, to take his day off to go to court, to have it thrown out, because nobody really gives a crap about enforcing any of this because it's been legalized there.
Well, I'm going to challenge that. We discussed that New York City has a sheriff, as some people may be surprised to learn, Anthony Miranda, right? And he and our recently indicted mayor came up with something called Operation Padlock, right? Where they've been going around on their horses and they are raiding and padlocking these illicit stores.
As they should
Okay?
be.
And every time they put a padlock on one, 2 pop up.
Yeah, exactly.
And they have, for all intents and purposes, unlimited resources.
Mhm.
So then, I'm going to ask again, Sue, and I'm challenging you because we had fun outside. How do you do that? It's the whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
So how do you effectively enforce your ban?
Well, you basically need a federal ban so that, in fact, illegal, like this is my thing about K2 spice and bath salts. States do a horrible job trying to regulate this. Once there's a federal ban, you really think that a legitimate gas station wants to go against federal law and be shut down? At that point, you get the DEA, you get the Justice Department, you get other people involved that are higher than the sheriff from New York, who really, this is not their highest priority.
Well, and that's an interesting point, because what we battle with is, for instance, South Carolina, we have like this company that came in. I mean, they are, I really believe truly, these are legit, it's a legitimate business. They're doing the testing, they showed us the stuff. And so you can't, essentially, what happens is when you do a total ban, you punish the good actors, people that are legitimate businessmen and women, and they're asking us to regulate us so we can do this, so we can sell this product, and help people. And so I
Well,
and I think we'll always
the
have.
synthetic cannabinoid thing is not medicine at all. If you're
Well, no,
talking
I'm
about medical
for medical
marijuana,
cannabis, yeah,
that's different, I would say. And I'd also say there's really not one state that has done medical that hasn't almost immediately moved to legalize. If this was really about medicine, why would you need the next day to put something on the ballot to actually legalize it? It's not about medicine. It's about legalizing drugs. And let's be honest here.
Well, I will tell you this, it'll probably be years before there's any debate on recreational, but I do think there's a need for the medicine. I mean, particularly people that, and I always go back on the opioid epidemic, and people that we prescribe all these opioids to our veterans, and we have, I mean, children that this data shown where medical cannabis can be very helpful.
No, that's
with
Epidiolex. That's FDA approved. That's very different than giving a kid the Stanley Brothers,
Well, no, but this would be prescribed. I mean, it's
I
very tight
totally
box. It'd be
get it.
prescribed.
I have no problem with that, except it can't be prescribed because it's still illegal under federal law. You get a doctor's recommendation. There's no prescription. And I know the lunch thing that's starting soon, Kevin's going to be debating whether this should be in Schedule 3, which is somewhat of a joke because it would have to have a prescription and be sold in a pharmacy. So good luck with that.
We have the pharmacy. Yeah.
So that's the big secret behind rescheduling cannabis, is that then it actually does become regulated by the federal government.
Right.
And then, it does, you have to go to the pharmacy, the FDA gets involved. Maybe out of the frying pan into the fire. But you say a federal ban. We've had a federal ban on marijuana, heroin, cocaine since 1970, arguably earlier, 1939, the Marijuana Taxation Act. How's that worked?
Well, I'd say just to add, I mean, on the narrow issue of Delta 8, I mean, at least anecdotally, I've heard several reports that some of the anxiety and paranoia that people experience using traditional cannabis is alleviated by the Delta 8. So I'd hate to throw the baby out with the bathwater without further research, because there may well be efficacy to medicalize Delta 8 for people who don't tolerate other forms of THC.
Yeah. There aren't
Haven't seen
any.
anything on it at all that's tested in humans, placebo-controlled, randomized,
There,
et
there,
cetera.
I mean, there
Ju-
aren't any of those.
Just,
There was a-
I
it's
just mean
anecdotal.
anecdotally,
Well,
things that I hear,
anecdotal.
things on Reddit, communities on Reddit talking about it. Citizen science. I'm not saying that
So
these are
that's bullshit.
studies. I'm saying, well, I think we should look into it. We do studies, we do clinical trials, and we
Well, should
confirm
be
or we
doing-
deny
right,
it.
But we need to do the clinical
ban isn't
trials.
But
gonna
it's
help
hard
that.
to do clinical trials when the federal government says there's no medicinal
but there's
value
all-
and won't allow you to
No,
study
but
it.
you can
No, you
study it.
can
and-
Now
study
you
it.
can.
Wait,
Now
you-
you can.
well,
That's
You can't-
new.
No, you've been able to study it.
Thank
It's
you.
just
You've been
work.
able to
You
study
just
it.
have to apply for the
Exactly
work.
right.
And
It's-
University of
It's been
Mississippi got the
totally
mandate.
available to do that.
Yeah.
But it
thank
hasn't
you.
been something that has been very
the Delta
consistently
8 was
studied for
studied a
50
lot
years.
back in the 1970s. So if it truly has this, I agree, we should do the study to do it. But you certainly shouldn't medicalize it before you do that.
Right.
This gentleman had a question.
A question about hemp regulation, actually, which we're facing now in California. I represent California Normal, and you may know, just in the last week, our governor actually had an emergency regulation, issued sort of a blanket ban
Mhm.
on intoxicating hemp.
Mhm.
And we quite agree actually with the governor and with the panel there that these products should not be on the market. The problem we had, however, with this particular regulation was the definition of intoxicating hemp. And it was defined to mean any hemp product that had any detectable amount of THC or other cannabinoids other than CBD. And of course, if you're dealing with natural hemp extracts, it's practically impossible to eliminate other cannabinoids than CBD, but they aren't intoxicating. A lot of these are really medicinal preparations that are done sometimes under organic conditions that are well tested and will deliver, maybe 25, 50 milligrams of CBD, and they'll have like a milligram of THC. And there's a lot of demand for these products, and they're being recommended by responsible doctors. Now, what would you suggest as a definition for intoxicating hemp?
Good question.
Yeah, we're looking into that now because Mary Miller's amendment also has the exact same language. And the issue becomes you can't really find CBD that doesn't have traces of THC in it. So I don't know. We're trying to figure that out.
And to your point, there's also the entourage effect, of course, right? Where you want those cannabinoids to commingle with each other. Maybe not THC, a psychoactive effect, but again, this is something that continues to be studied and we learn about. I mean, just as we're continuing to discover new cannabinoids.
Yeah, no, we need that. Part of the problem here is that you have lawyers getting ahead of the scientists and, people voting on medicine, not really understanding the science. So
Much like opioids.
I've got a somewhat related question there. Sue, I've noticed on your slide about what's going on in Congress that there was also language in the appropriations bill. And as you know, appropriations bills have to be passed every year, and the Farm Bill could just keep being a year extension in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
So just what are your thoughts on an outlook on anything happening in Congress, either through appropriations or through authorizing legislation on this issue?
on the semi-synthetic cannabinoid issue, the Farm Bill, God knows. I mean, we have Debbie Stabenow, who's the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee, retiring. You would think that she would want the legacy to be that she got the Farm Bill passed because it's one of the biggest, most important pieces of legislation. I mean, the joke of this is this, one thing is like 1/1,000,000th of a millionth of the Farm Bill. It's billions of dollars of farm aid and food aid and WIC and it's unbelievable. So yes, there you go. So I don't know. Now they just came out with the list of things that they want to finish in the lame duck, and the Farm Bill got on the list. So I don't know. We've met with all four corners for the Senate House Agriculture Committee on all of this stuff last week. Not clear if it's going to move or not. And this person's thing is the thing, like they're not looking to close down the whole CBD industry, but the whole thing with this any detectable levels of THC is an issue, and somebody needs to figure that part out. As far as the appropriations bill, it's in the House Agriculture Appropriations Bill for FY 2025. That has not gone to the floor. It's not in the Senate bill. Who knows? But we have a better chance of getting it. If it ever gets passed, you're right. They have to do something in appropriations after the CRs are finished. They're probably not going to do appropriations till after the election. And the CR that they're passing is going to go to December 19th, right before Christmas. But if there was a chance for it to happen, it would probably be more likely in the appropriations bill if it happens.
One thing I wanted to bring up is my concern and or frustration with part of the hemp industry. And that is that we are so focused on CBD and also on synthetic cannabinoids that I feel like industrial hemp that could be used in such a sustainable manner. So we're talking about products like hempcrete, carpet, health and beauty aids, apparel, paper, 25,000 items. And I'll give you one quick example in the cannabis industry, how industrial hemp could be helpful. We produce so much waste with our plastic. So a lot of products come in an eighth. And if you're a medical patient, you can buy up to 3 ounces. So you could actually buy 24 containers. What happens to those? Most of them end up in the trash. A lot of people are concerned about their neighbors seeing things in their recycling, perhaps. Also, if it's a black plastic, oftentimes those cannot be scanned by recycling in certain municipalities. They don't have the technology to do that. So if you buy a pre-rolled joint, that is 1 gram of product, can actually be even smaller, but that takes 50 grams of packaging. So you have that 50-gram plastic package right there. That again goes into our waste stream. And again, those examples of lack of sustainability in the cannabis industry are huge. Meanwhile, we could be developing bioplastics out of hemp that can also degrade, and we could have incentives for that. So anyway, so part of my concern is that I think we need much more investment and focus on growing industrial hemp and turning it into products like hempcrete and much, much more. And I do feel like that's being left in the lurch. Right now, if you grow in New Jersey, and we only have roughly about 500 farmers that grow roughly 200 acres, pretty small, because our land is quite expensive. But at any rate, if they want to process that, you have to go to Vermont or Maryland. That's the closest processing centers to make it into anything of import in the industrial area. Supposedly, there is a processing center coming into Pennsylvania, which will make it closer. But can you imagine if we actually invested in something in our state and we incentivized the farmers that were growing industrial hemp to produce these things? Small houses for people and much, much more. Food
Water
also.
bottles? Can you do
Food
water
is
bottles?
Absolutely. Water bottles. And actually hemp is a superfood as well. High in protein, has the omegas, a lot of fiber. So anyway, that's just my frustration. I don't know if there's a question
but
in there.
thank
Just
you,
something
'cause
I'm concerned
We,
about.
we discussed this a little bit out as well, and we probably should have just forgotten the PowerPoints and had a chat today. There are so many common sense solutions, those kind of middle ground common sense solutions where we
all
had
agree.
agreement, right? Unfortunately, as you know, and as everyone knows, everything's on an extreme, right? For politics these days. And I think, are you shutting us down? Or is there
Oh,
a question?
just when I have a question.
Oh, please. Yeah, of course.
So I'm walking around with a mic, but it's not really a question. It's more of a statement. So I'm from Oregon. And as you've watched Oregon in the news, we're just, right at the cutting edge. But there was some comments earlier about, why law enforcement doesn't do enough to regulate. And honestly, it's not law enforcement, at least not in where I'm from and from what I've heard. It's starting from above. It's starting from, the leadership in Oregon. Let's say I'll just talk for Oregon. And we tend to get way ahead of ourselves and pass legislation. And even when we legalized cannabis, we weren't ready for what was going to come. And that's what I'm seeing in so many other states is they're not ready. And there was not the regulations in place that even law enforcement can do anything about. For example, law enforcement and any of the regulatory bodies had to say, hey, by the way, we're coming to investigate to see if you're doing illegal things. And we'll be there on Tuesday, And so I think they've changed some of that, but it really starts from up above. And for our law enforcement, they didn't, as soon as it passed on the ballot, even though it hadn't taken effect, they weren't arresting anyone with, just user amounts or small amounts of, not arresting or even citing them, or well, they weren't arresting them even before it passed. But, and so because they knew that there wasn't anything that's going to be done about it on the DA's side or the judge's side or anywhere else for that matter. So, and then we went ahead and legalized all drugs, which was a fun experiment that clearly didn't work, again, because none of the regulatory body, none of the treatment was put in place. There wasn't enough access to treatment. And the way they set it up, it was like, hey, by the way, you could call this number and not get the $100 ticket for having any kind of drug. But if you don't want to pay the $100 and you're not going to show up and you're not going to call, we're not going to do anything about it. So we have now recriminalized some drugs. And so we'll see how that goes. But I think I'm hesitant to blame law enforcement for it because that's not where it starts. It's about setting the regulations up in place and making it so that, before we tend to get ahead of ourselves. And I am a lawyer and I agree the lawyers get ahead of the science. So I will agree with that statement.
Well, I totally agree with what you're saying. It's not, because law enforcement can only do what's there. And if it's not regulation, then you run into they're just raiding, and now you got potential constitutional issues and lawsuits, and so it's difficult for them. But it is on the legislature, it's on the general assemblies, because which is why I think we need. It's coming. We have, if we don't regulate it, and we're dealing with this now, we don't know. We can't tell people that the Department of Ag in South Carolina is saying it's unlawful. You can't put this in the food product. The Attorney General is saying, well, we can't, because the lawyers, we're like, you can't do that because we don't have it regulated. So now you're shutting down businesses. And so the government doesn't know what to do because people are failing to act, because some people don't want to regulate it because they're afraid of now it's just going to be people smoking pot and driving on sidewalks, which is ridiculous, by the way. But that's where we are. And so because the general assemblies are so behind and won't move to just put regulations in place to give law enforcement some kind of structure on, this is what we can do, here are our confines, we have this problem. And so I agree with you. It's more on the politicians and not the law enforcement.
Yep.
I think we have last two questions, right?
Yeah. So we're all going to have to rely on the politicians to solve the problem. That'll work.
Good luck.
Yes, Senator. Yes, Senator.
I had a follow-up to your question, actually, because I think that we all can see how regulation could be beneficial, but do you think that there is a potential of criminalization if there is a total ban on these types of substances like K2 and like spice? Because people are gonna use drugs anyway, like whether it's medicinal or not. Having this total ban, do you think that it's not just shutting down businesses, but it's also to lead to another just
War on
layer and
drugs.
just another set of mass
I don't
incarceration?
think so. I mean, listen, no one's shutting down the cannabis stuff. It's just, why do we need these things there's 185 different permutations that nobody understands what they are, no research, no long-term studies. At least with cannabis, we actually do have a history with it. There is some science. Just saying, I don't know, how many drugs do people need to have to choose from? Is this like, you go to a grocery store and it's the snack aisle? I mean, at some point, yeah, people are going to use what's cheap and what's available. And right now, that's these synthetic cannabinoids. They're cheaper than they're cheaper than marijuana on the illicit market. It's $5 for a thing of gummies. So, there's
The pendulum, right? It was a ban, right? And then it swung back and we had all this legalization, medical, then adult use. And now, like you're describing, under the hemp bill. So it's now this way. Now we're talking about bringing it back. I think at some point, if we arrived at that center, right, that point of Pareto optimality, to take a phrase from economics, maybe we'd have a solution here, like we were discussing, maybe. But if it goes fully the other way, then we're going to get back. And I think to your point, with criminalization and the war on drugs and disproportionately incarcerating certain demographics and the problem
we're not
arising
talking
out.
about we're talking about heavy fines on the businesses. We're not talking about criminalizing users. And I don't think with marijuana, that's not happening. It's not happening with the Delta 8 stuff at all.
Oh, South Carolina is happening. But I wish there was like this much, but you're right. It will create, I mean, we're still, in South Carolina, people still get arrested you can still go to jail for simple possession of marijuana. And so if you have a blanket ban, I mean, you just create the sense of it'll just increase the
So it is a
criminal rate.
priority for law enforcement in your state to arrest people. It's one
Oh
of
yeah,
the
if they
few
if they
states I've
if they
ever heard of
think
in
they
this
smell
country.
marijuana, they will arrest. I mean, it's yeah.
Interesting.
I had a lieutenant with the sheriff's office in New York City testify under oath that she could tell the difference between marijuana and hemp because she could smell the higher Delta 9 THC concentration.
That is ridiculous.
Lieutenant Rosa.
That's
Okay. I also had a client who was raided by 10 law enforcement officers in full fatigues, camouflage fatigues, with AR-15 rifles. Came into his store, handcuffed him and his 16-year-old son for 4 hours while they conducted an administrative inspection.
I didn't find
They took the kid's PlayStation because it might have had certain files on it relating to the illicit
What were they
activity.
shutting down? The Delta?
He was a smoke shop. He was a smoke shop selling hemp-derived products. And because they lived upstairs and they padlocked the store, they wouldn't let them go home afterwards because the whole building was now a crime scene and padlocked. So I think law enforcement is doing things. I just think this is, again, the problem. It's one extreme or the other. You have law enforcement in New York, maybe turning a blind eye to what's happening right under their noses. Sorry for the mixed metaphor. And you go upstate, and I live in the city, so for me, upstate's the Bronx and all points north, where they're going, you know, a little ballistic, quite literally.
And yet, yeah, I have slides that I didn't use. So yes, it's illegal in New York, and yet it's being sold in every county in the state. I have members in every county in New York State. There's not one county that this stuff isn't in gas stations, convenience stores. They're not being shut down. So I don't know why they're going after Europe. I mean, what can I tell you?
I don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. There was a question over here. Thank you.
So it's a question for the senator. As your state is considering legalization either for recreational or medicinal, are you also considering additional funding for the toxicologists? Are you considering additional funding for the experts that the prosecutors will need? Are you considering extra funding for the law enforcement to do not just the inspection, to shut down the unregulated entities that are dispensing, but also for the increased impaired driving cases? All these other things associated with your legislation and regulatory effort?
So for the law enforcement piece is certainly in there. And by the way, we're not even experimenting with recreational. There's no legislation pending. It's specifically medicinal cannabis, and it's very, very restrictive. Very, very restrictive, and it had to be. I mean, pharmacists. So we have the funding for obviously the experts. Now, not the DA's department, but law enforcement definitely, because that was a concern. Well, now we're going to need, you know, the ability to staff more people, and even when it comes to finding out, just testing these products, to find out what level it is, when you go to the court system, you know, we call it SLED, our state FBI, really, that tests all these products. We're actually now, even before medical cannabis, we're expanding or increasing their funding, just testing, because of all this new, all these new products coming in. We're so backlogged with testing. So what happens is we have people. I do some criminal defense too. Is that you have people getting arrested and they're pending charges, or some people in jail that can't get out on bond. And 2 years later, they haven't tested the damn drugs yet. And they keep saying, well, we don't have the resources. And then sometimes I wonder if it's really, we don't, because it's interesting, certain cases, the results are like almost immediate. And then you have some, and you look at the demographics on who's arrested, and that we can get, that's a whole different story. So I'm not sure it's all about the funding, but we do have that piece because that's important. Because that was a pushback. So we said, well, look, we'll give you all this, and still we can't pass it. So, yeah, and especially I'd be interested in the expert with the smell. I mean, it's ridiculous. Oh my goodness. We have, and by the way, I found legislation to remove to remove, and some states have done this, to remove the smell of marijuana as a probable cause, because I've seen it. You read, it's almost identical language in the police reports. Upon approaching the vehicle, I smelled a raw odor, a strong odor of marijuana. Most times they don't find marijuana, but it's a avenue to search your car and find something else. But that's not constitutional. You shouldn't be able to do that. And so this whole, I can smell it. I mean, especially now with hemp and Delta, CB, all these products, you can go buy a pre-roll that's legal, and the vapes. I mean, so it's very difficult. But I've seen, at least in South Carolina, that's being used to search people's cars and to go on a fishing expedition, if you will.
Can I just say thank you for the question, because where's our.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we have a panel waiting to sit where
Oh,
you're sitting.
well, you're right.
I really enjoy all of the exchange. Some of it was a little, but I enjoyed it, and I want to thank you all for participating. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.